Magnetic resonance imaging of patients with conventional ICD is actually contraindicated, as you might imagine. In September, the FDA approved a novel ICD system specially designed for full-body MRI. The trial is largely based on data that was published in JACC, and I want to talk about that, please, first. This is full-body MRI in patients with an implantable cardioverter defibrillator, primary results of a randomized study, and I'm with Dr. Michael Gold, who is a professor of medicine at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston. It has been 30 years exactly now since the first ICD was approved. Tell us about this new system and why it's so different.
Well, lots of things have changed in those 30 years,
Yes.
and one of the things that has changed is the way that we can image patients for other reasons. And MRI is the most rapidly growing imaging modality. And for a number of reasons, there's risks of MRI in patients with devices, from devices moving, heating, so that devices don't function normally, damage to devices, stimulation, induction of arrhythmias, and so on and so forth. And while specialized centers can, in fact, do MRIs frequently in patients with devices, we know that those patients who need MRI, some of the strongest indications, such as strokes or back pain, their patients are 30 to 50-fold less likely to get an MRI if, in fact, they have a defibrillator in place.
Now, this was in the June 23rd issue of JACC, and so tell us about the results. You were using 1.5 Tesla machines?
Right. So a specialized system was developed that was MRI-safe, or thought to be MRI-safe, and we did a randomized trial in which all patients who had a standard indication for a single or dual chamber ICD received the device, the MRI-compatible device, but they were randomized to either undergo an MRI or not undergo an MRI. And then we compared pacing thresholds and sensing thresholds following the MRI or the sham MRI procedure in those patients, and we found no difference. So we confirmed it was very safe, and what was done additionally is that we placed very little restrictions on these patients. So in the past, MRI was typically done in patients who needed it for the head or the back or the legs, but not for the chest and heart area, and also patients who were pacer dependent were excluded, and all those patients were allowed in this study.
And you found no effect on sensing of VT or VF and therapy delivery with just a minimal delay to detection, but that was within normal limits.
Right, and that delay was no different in those patients who received MRI versus those patients who didn't receive MRI, which we're actually presenting here at American Heart Association this afternoon.
Ah, okay. And most of the clinical MRI systems operate at 1.5 T, but an increasing number of them actually are going to 3.0. We don't have the data yet for that.
Right, so those studies have not been done yet, so we really can't say at this point the safety in 3 Tesla. In fact, there's very limited data even off-label use, where there's thousands of patients who've had MRIs off-label with ICDs. There's only a handful who've had 3 Tesla MRIs.
So what are you presenting here?
So what we're presenting is our study with VTVF. So defibrillators do many things that pacemakers do. They sense and they pace, but to be able to treat ventricular tachyarrhythmias and save lives is what's unique about defibrillators. And that actually was not part of the FDA approval, or at least the study was not a primary endpoint, but we collected a lot of data of showing ventricular fibrillation, either induced or spontaneous, in these patients, and we show very good safety profile and efficacy similar to those patients who before they got an MRI.
So now, in September of 2015, the Medtronic Evera MRI ICD was approved. So for patients with MRI-compatible pacemakers or ICDs about to undergo an MRI, what do you do?
So one of the features of this is that there's a mode that the patient can be programmed to. So very simple programming that will inactivate shock, so the patient can't get a shock in the MRI bore if there is any sensing issues, even though we didn't find any. So the patient needs to be monitored during that time. However, pacing will still be active in those patients who need it. A safety feature we put into this was that mode that turns off shock therapy automatically gets turned off so they're back in normal mode within 6 hours. So if someone forgets to reprogram or the patient leaves or something doesn't happen, it won't just be sent out. And unfortunately, remote monitoring, which is something we frequently do with devices independent of the MRI issue, finds that patients following operations or other reasons why device get turned off, we find a disturbing incidence of patients who it didn't get turned back on, it didn't get turned back on right. So
let's make it automatic.
Yeah, so this is an automatic sort of safety net for patients in it, which I think actually is a nice feature that we sort of recognize our human limitations sometimes.
And finally, what patients would you give this device to? Who are optimal patients?
It's a very interesting question. Trying to predict who will need an MRI is challenging. As the population's aging and the type of patients who we implant defibrillators into, estimates are that in a typical defibrillator population, at least a third of patients would probably be appropriate for an MRI during the lifetime of their device, even if a much smaller percentage are getting them. And it may be for pacemakers, some have estimated as high as 50% in the lifetime of their device. So trying to distinguish who those patients are difficult. Clearly, those patients who are known to need an MRI because of a tumor, some sort of cancer, some sort of head injury, some syndrome where they'll follow it, is simple. In other patients, I think it's a clinical decision about whether the unknown of whether they'll develop an indication for an MRI, which will simplify things in the future, is a reason to do it. So there's really no reason to exclude a patient specifically by this device because it has all the features of a standard device.
Right. Going forward, do you think that we're going to see more and more devices that are just strictly MRI compatible?
Yes, I mean, all devices will be MRI compatible, and they're in the works already. So just as pacemakers are going in that direction, there's no question that all defibrillators will become MRI safe at some point in the future. And we'll also need to move to more complicated devices such as CRT devices, which presently are not MRI compatible either.
Well, the FDA approval for the Medtronic device was in September, and the paper that we're talking about was in the June 23rd issue of the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. For CSWN, I'm Executive Editor Rick McGuire.